Human reproduction, last video of the semester for this class. Wrapping up Biology 110, longest semester ever. It's 2020, y'all. So let's start big picture. We're mammals. And there's actually three different types of mammals alive in the world today. There's monotremes, marsupials, and placentals. So monotremes would include echidnas and the platypus. And these guys are weird because they lay eggs and still produce milk. So they lay eggs. Weird. Marsupials, which would include the mammals of Australia like kangaroos, they give live birth to this little really immature baby. And then the baby, after it's been born, it crawls up mama's fur and crawls into their pouch, mama's pouch. And inside the pouch, it's warm and it's safe and it's dry. And there's actually little milk glands in there that produce milk for them to nurse. So the womb basically serves as the pouch basically serves as an external womb to help complete development. And once the little Joey is big enough, it can actually leave the pouch and come back in. So it helps them transition to being independent from mom. Everybody else, cows, whales, dogs, cats, tigers, these are all placental mammals. Oh, and humans too, of course. So the placenta is an organ that grows during pregnancy for placental mammals, and it's an organ that's unique to the placental mammals. What does the placenta do? And by the way, you can see the placenta here, right? So this is the uterus, and here's the baby, and this is the placenta. So what does the placenta do? It basically serves as a mediator between the baby and mom. So the baby's kind of like a little parasite. It's sucking nutrients and oxygen out of mom's body. It's producing waste. And so the placenta helps the baby to get nutrients and oxygen from mom and to give carbon dioxide and other stuff to mom that the baby doesn't want or need. And at the same time, it keeps them relatively separate. In other words, the placenta prevents their bloodstreams from mixing, but allowing them to exchange gases and nutrients. So the placenta also helps the baby grow until it's pretty developed. So if you've ever seen a cow or a deer give birth, the baby pops out and basically it's walking around after a couple of hours. So that's because they can grow really large and become highly developed in the womb, and that's because of the help of the placenta. Otherwise, they'd have to have the pouch like the kangaroos do, or even laying eggs. So the placenta allows pretty advanced development while still inside mom. In humans, only females can reproduce. That's a shocker. Only females can have babies. And for human women, the reproductive window opens in late middle school, early teen years. So puberty does its thing, and eventually they start releasing eggs and can get pregnant. So usually we time or label the beginning of the opening of the reproductive window with an event called menarche. And this is when the woman first experiences menstruation. So that means basically that's our way of keeping track when she first ovulated. And then for the next 40 years or so, the woman will have a cycle of ovulation and menstruation. We'll look at that in more detail in upcoming slides. But basically, this is when she's ovulating and can get pregnant. So that begins, again, like late middle school, early high school, and begins until ends in the late 40s, early 50s. Menopause is technically defined as when a woman hasn't menstruated for a year. And so as they get older, their ability to sustain a pregnancy has declined. They're not as healthy. Their body isn't as vigorous as it was when they were younger. And so basically the body shuts down the reproductive window. Right? And by the way, the timing of all these can vary widely from person to person and even culture to culture. So let's define some more terms. Ovulation is simply when the egg leaves the ovary. So women have two ovaries, one on the left, one on the right. And the ovaries have these immature eggs stored in them that were first developing when the woman was in her mama's womb. And then the eggs finish developing, and the ovaries kind of more or less take turns releasing an egg. And so ovulation is the release of the egg. The egg leaves the ovary. Here's the ovary. It ovulates and releases an egg. and the egg moves into the fallopian tube. So the fallopian tube is just a tube that connects the ovary to the uterus. So this unfertilized egg travels down the fallopian tube, and if it's going to become fertilized by sperm, this is where the sperm need to go. So the sperm need to travel up through the uterus, and some of them are going to go right and some are going to go left, and the ones that pick this direction are going to swim down the fallopian tube and then fertilize the egg there. So fertilization actually happens in the fallopian tube. Once the egg is fertilized, it will begin undergoing mitosis and move from one diploid cell to several cells and then to many cells. And then that fertilized egg arrives in the uterus, and then it implants in the wall of the uterus, and then it develops into an embryo and then eventually a baby. So here's the same thing, just bigger picture. So again, ovary, ovulation releases the egg. It moves down the fallopian tube. Here's the sperm. So this one's fertilized. It begins splitting into 2, 4, 8, 16 cells, etc. And then arriving in the uterus, it implants in the uterine wall. So every 28 days or so, a female will ovulate and release an egg into a fallopian tube. Meanwhile, the uterus will prepare for that potentially fertilized egg by thickening its wall. We'll talk more about that in a second. But not every egg is going to be fertilized. So let's start with what happens if it is fertilized. So if an egg is fertilized by the sperm, then the egg will implant in the uterine wall, and that will lead to a pregnancy. But if the egg is not fertilized by sperm, then the egg isn't going to implant in the uterine wall. And in fact, the uterine wall, which has been preparing for the arrival of a fertilized egg, it bails. It's like, the egg's here, but it didn't get fertilized, so it's impossible to get pregnant. So let's tear down all of this work we've done preparing the uterus for a pregnancy. So the tear down of all those blood vessels and nutrients, this is the bleeding that occurs during menstruation. So just to go in a little bit more detail about the menstrual cycle, again, ovary, ovulation. So here's the egg in the fallopian tube, traveling down the fallopian tube. Meanwhile, the lining of the uterus is preparing for the arrival of the fertilized egg. If an unfertilized egg arrives, then it bails and it tears down the lining of the uterus, and then again that leads to the bleeding during the menstrual period. So if we look at it as a cycle, we'll typically begin by counting it on the first day of the cycle, the menstrual cycle. So about a week worth of bleeding. And then the uterus begins to prepare for the potential arrival of another or of a fertilized egg. So the uterus lining begins thickening again after about a week. Ovulation occurs around 14 days after the start of the period. Now that's variable, so it can be 9 days, it could be 20 days, it just varies from person to person and can even vary month to month. But on average, it's about 14 days in. So at this point, the egg is released from the ovary, and over the next couple of days, it's got time to travel down the fallopian tube to arrive in the uterus. Meanwhile, the uterus lining continues to thicken to prepare for its arrival, and at this point, it's just waiting for a fertilized egg to arrive. And after about 28 days, approximately a month, if a fertilized egg has not arrived, then all of that lining is shed over the period of 7 days, and the whole cycle starts over. So again, it's about a 28-day cycle, although that can vary from person to person and month to month and can vary with age. So everything's kind of flexible. Let's talk about what happens if a fertilized egg does arrive in the uterus. So again, it implants here in the lining of the uterus. Technically, that's called the endometrium. And once the fertilized egg is implanted in the uterus, it sends a hormonal signal that says to the ovaries, okay, we're pregnant, you can stop ovulating. So a woman will not ovulate during the pregnancy, and she will also not have her period because it would be bad to shed this lining because we've got a fertilized egg here. So there's no menstruation. So the whole cycle shuts down for the duration of the pregnancy. During the pregnancy, I mentioned that the placenta is going to help the baby and the mom exchange gases and nutrients and so on. And it's really interesting. So the placenta is attached to mom. So when she eats a meal or breathes oxygen, it goes to the placenta. And then the nutrients and the gases are exchanged and are absorbed by blood vessels from the baby. And then they pass through blood vessels in the umbilical cord. And so basically babies in the womb are fed and breathe through their belly button, through the umbilical cord. So the bloodstream of mom and the baby don't mix. The baby is responsible for its heart will beat and distribute blood through its body, so it's responsible for its own circulation. The baby is not responsible for getting its own oxygen because it can't breathe because it's inside of mama. And so its oxygen is delivered through the umbilical cord, and that means its lungs basically aren't functioning. So a baby won't take its first breath until after it's born. Wastes are produced, and waste like CO2 will leave and go back to mom for her to breathe out. Um, Eventually, when the baby's larger and coming close to full term, it will start producing urine and feces. It may pee in the womb, and then just because it's breathing in the amniotic fluid, it's drinking it. You can drink your own pee in the womb, but it's not a big deal. But pooping in the womb is more of a big deal. So typically pooping doesn't happen. Sometimes the baby will poop in there, but that's not until it's full term or even sometimes during the process of labor. A pregnancy lasts about 266 days, and we can break it up into 3 stages. So the embryo stage is technically weeks 3 to 8. So the first 3 weeks or so, the baby is, so to speak, is just a ball of cells, and then organs start to form starting around week 3. And so at this point, it's an embryo. The fetal stage is weeks 9 through 36. Again, full term is about 38 weeks. So during the fetal stage, the organs continue to develop and the body continues to form. And then a baby is said to be full term about 37 to 38 weeks in. And at this point, it can survive outside of the womb. Although with our technology of, NICU units and medicines and so on and so forth, after about 26 weeks, the baby has a 90% chance of survival. So even if they come, if a baby is born 10 weeks early, it's still got a pretty good chance of survival. 22 weeks-ish is kind of the cutoff. So at 21 weeks, the baby just isn't developed enough, especially the lungs, in order to survive outside the womb very easily. It can be done, but it's difficult. Humans, I mentioned, have a 266-day pregnancy on average. Smaller mammals, it's much shorter. So a rabbit is 33 days, and a elephant is almost 2 years. So again, about 38 weeks. This is often split up into trimesters. So each trimester is 3 months long. So oftentimes, if you're talking to a pregnant woman, she's going to be saying, "Oh, I'm in my second trimester, or I'm in my first trimester, or whatever." It's just an easy way to split the pregnancy up, and you kind of act differently. You go to the doctor a lot more frequently in your third trimester than you do in your first trimester, for example. All right, and this is just showing some of the development. So I mentioned the first 2 weeks. It's really not even an embryo. It's a ball of cells. And then an embryo begins to form at the beginning of the embryonic stage, about 3 weeks in. And you can see that all of these different organ systems develop over a long period of time. So it's kind of a spectrum. So nerves begin to develop, but really the brain and spinal cord aren't really fully developed until, 25 weeks in. The heart begins to form, but it's not really fully developed until the beginning of the third trimester. Sorry, not the third trimester, the beginning of the 9th week, and so on and so forth. So again, kind of a spectrum. All right, that's pregnancy. What happens during childbirth? So let's say a baby's gone full term, and the baby or the mom's body or both say, "Okay, let's get this thing out of here." There's a lot of changes that need to happen, because basically during pregnancy, the body is designed to keep the baby in liquid. so it's not breathing air, to keep it inside mom, and to really keep it cut off from the outside world. And during birth, all of those things are going to switch. It's going to have to start breathing oxygen. It's going to have to literally detach from mom. So it's going to lose, the placenta is going to get pulled out of the uterus, and the placenta comes out with the baby. The baby has to go down the birth canal, which is really narrow. It's going to have to leave through the cervix, which is a small hole in the uterus. So all these things need to get bigger. Even the hip bone, the pelvis needs to stretch out to make room for the giant head of the baby. All right, so all of that to say that when labor is getting close, one of the first things that starts to happen is the cervix dilates. So again, the cervix is the opening to the uterus, so the sperm would have traveled through there during fertilization, prior to fertilization. And so the cervix begins to get bigger to make room for the baby to come out. So we call that dilating. And so the midwife or nurse practitioner or doctor, whoever will, you know, as labor is approaching, they'll actually measure how big the cervix is, and the larger it is, then that's a signal that you're getting close to going into full-blown labor. Sometimes you hear about the water breaking, and what's going on there is, I mentioned the baby is in a liquid sac breathing water, so that they're actually breathing amniotic fluid. They're in the amnion, so it's basically like a big sac holding all these fluids in. And as labor begins, this amniotic sac can break, and all these fluids can drain out through the cervix and out through the vagina. So basically, it's like a if it happens all at once, it could be a rush of fluid that pours out in a relatively short time. When the water breaks, it doesn't necessarily mean the baby's coming right away, but it means that the body is preparing for delivery. I think when my wife's water broke for our first kiddo, I think it was still like maybe 18 hours, 15 hours until my daughter was born. So it's just a sign that you're getting close to having a baby. All right, so after the cervix dilates, then the smooth muscle of the uterus begin to contract rhythmically. And so basically that is to just position the baby and to shove it out the birth canal. And so ideally the baby is going to shift its position prior to birth. So a lot of times when they're in the womb, their head is up, right? But then as they prepare for birth, they want to drop and get into the birthing position. They want to leave head first. That's going to make things way easier, and that way they can start breathing, right away. If a baby doesn't flip, then it's called a breech baby, and so there's different techniques you can do to try to flip the baby right side up, or right side down, I guess. After the baby comes out, then the placenta comes out. So usually when the baby is born, one of the first things the doctor will do is cut the umbilical cord. So then the placenta can be pulled out by yanking on the umbilical cord. You need to get the placenta out of there, and it's no longer needed. Your belly button is where they cut the umbilical cord. You probably already know that. So sometimes a C-section or cesarean section is necessary. So this is about 1/3 of U.S. pregnancies, for example. And this can happen for a lot of different reasons. There could be a health complication. Maybe you're carrying twins or more. And so in order to cut down on risks for mom or for the baby, the C-section might be necessary. And what happens is basically they just cut through the abdominal wall and they pull the baby out through, not the stomach, but basically through the abdominal area. And then they pull out the placenta, and then they sew you back up. So the baby doesn't exit via the birth canal. The baby comes out the abdomen. A newborn baby is a miracle. Actually, when they come out, they're all purple and squished and swollen, and their head looks like a cone, and it's pretty horrific. But they are a miracle. They're wonderful, beautiful, fantastic. There's a couple things that can happen, like twins, that are kind of interesting. So there's different categories of twins. These are the big three: fraternal twins, identical twins, and conjoined twins. So a fraternal twin forms when two eggs were released. So both ovaries released eggs, or maybe one ovary released two eggs, doesn't matter. And then sperm fertilize each of those eggs. So in fraternal twins, it's just two siblings that are the exact same age. Right? They could be brother and sister, it could be two brothers, it could be two sisters, and they're just as genetically related as, babies that are, or siblings that are born at different times. Identical twins are a little bit different, or a lot different. It's when a single egg is released through ovulation, it's fertilized by sperm, and then that egg, when it starts to split, it actually splits into two. So that one fertilized egg ultimately becomes two individuals. So identical twins share the same DNA. They've got the same DNA from mom and the same DNA from dad because they came from the same original fertilized egg. Conjoined twins are basically identical twins that didn't fully separate. So one egg got fertilized by a sperm, and then as it started to divide, it's halfway between being one individual and being two separate identical twins. So basically, they develop still conjoined. And sometimes they're called Siamese twins, and that was just because this condition was made famous by two two conjoined twins. Would you say this is one conjoined twin? I don't know. It's two individuals that are still attached. They were from Siam, and so they were called Siamese. But conjoined is the more accurate term. All right, and so just to illustrate what I just told you, in identical twins, sperm fertilizes one egg, and that one egg becomes two. In fraternal twins, it's two eggs. Each of them develops into an individual. And then conjoined twins, I don't have on here, but imagine this egg doesn't completely, or these eggs don't completely separate. That would be conjoined twins. There's also semi-identical twins. It's kind of weird. It's very rare. Basically, two sperm fertilize one egg, which then divides and separates into two babies. So they would be semi-identical. So they would have all of mom's DNA. They would have identical DNA from mom because they came from one egg. But their paternal DNA from dad, would be different. So they're not quite identical, but they're not fraternal either. Pretty weird. There's actually lots of weird things that can happen, but I'm hitting the highlights. Back to conjoined twins, just showing you some examples. Got some x-rays. So they can be conjoined in lots of different ways. It just depends on how the egg splits. So they can be connected at the chest, or they can be upside down. They can, like, their lateral line can be connected. They can have two arms or three arms or four arms. Same with legs. So lots of different really interesting ways. Now, depending on how they are conjoined will determine how viable they are. So some of these conditions, you can imagine it's going to be hard to birth them, and then it's going to create some complications. But for a really interesting example, the Hensel twins are pretty famous, a pair of twins from Minnesota, I believe. And there you can click the link in the PowerPoint. And they had a whole reality TV series. But it's really interesting. So you can see they've got separate heads and brains, and they even have their own heart and lungs. They have two stomachs, one liver, so it's kind of a mishmash. They're sharing some organs, but they have their own other organs. They have their own. So really interesting. So like she controls the right arm and she controls the left arm. I think one of their legs is shorter than the other, and I think they each control their own leg too. Yeah, it's really fascinating. They're pretty interesting. So you can look that up if you want more details. Hey, that's it. That's all the information I got for you.